On this episode of Sustainable Horizons.
When we purchase products, we pay for them twice. We pay for the product up front when we purchase it off the shelf, but then we also pay for its disposal when we get rid of it. There's so many cool applications for upcycled food. Could we put this into treats that people will buy at Target, animal treats that people will buy at their local Chuck and Don's, bricks that people literally will build buildings with?
Hey, Jon, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Logan. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. Jon Schroeder is here with us today. He is currently the Sustainable Materials Management Specialist at the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program and the manager of the Minnesota Materials Exchange. He has also worked with the likes of Project Drawdown, the World Wildlife Fund, and the EPA on projects relating to life cycle assessment, food waste, and extended producer responsibility. So to kick us off, why don't you tell us a bit about your educational background and what led you on your very fascinating career? I've seen you've bounced around a lot.
Grew up in Wisconsin, did my undergrad at the University of Minnesota. I was a business student, so on the West Bank, and did a minor in sustainability, so St. Paul campus. And I knew I liked the environment as far back as high school, so 15 plus years ago. And was like, all right, how do I dabble in sustainability? And I was an entrepreneurship major and a nonprofit management major. So I was like, either I'm going to be a billionaire or I'm going to be dirt poor, but working on causes that I love. I'm going to go one of two ways with this. And obviously I chose the latter because I work at MnTAP. So I get paid a good salary, but it's certainly not, anything that I'm bragging about. It is really fulfilling because I get to work all day long with businesses and organizations on environmental concerns that they're having. So I'm a waste specialist. I get to contact really any business that needs help. And assuming they say yes, I get to go in and help them. Back up a little bit, I was a master's degree candidate and student in sustainable systems. So I did that in Rochester, New York. And it was one of two programs at the time that had a sustainability curriculum for grad students. I actually had my sights set on another school and then found this school kind of as I was looking for jobs and didn't want the job, but actually wanted the school for my master's program. So bounced around a lot, like Logan said, and got exposure to a lot of different industries.
Awesome. So I've been really excited to get you on this podcast because we have talked about a lot of issues that have pertained to things like life cycle assessment. We actually recently talked with Sue Marshall on food waste and about NETZRO, who I know you and her have worked together. And we often allude to this concept of extended producer responsibility, which is also known as EPR. I know so many acronyms. When we have discussed how to handle things like plastic waste, but we've not really gotten into the nitty gritty of what EPR actually is. So why don't you just dive right into all of this and explain to us what life cycle assessment is? And I'm sure that'll kind of lead you into your work on food waste.
Yeah, life cycle assessment is this software that can be used. And it's also a frame of thinking. It's a methodology as to how you approach environmental problems. So if someone ever comes up to you and asks the question, what's better for the environment, a plastic bag from the grocery store or a paper bag? You could use life cycle assessment to assist you in determining that very answer. Life cycle assessment is very involved, or it can be. So there are 4 different phases to it. First, you have to have a goal. Then you have to have a scope. You have to have a system boundary. So what do you want to capture in what you're trying to study? Is it the entire raw material supply chain that it took to produce that plastic and paper bag? All of the transport involved? How is the bag being disposed of at the end of life? A landfill, an incinerator, a recycling facility, and everything in between. It's really up to you as the researcher to determine that. And then ultimately, your results help you determine what impact categories, where your numbers stand across many of those. So one of them is acidification. How is the product that's being produced contributing to acidification out in the real world in waterways, or eutrophication? You can have resource depletion. So a lot of the resources we use on a daily basis in our products, they are finite in the real world around us. And so when you use those in products, you're actually depleting the physical stock as it exists in our environment. And the list is very long. But you essentially get to determine which impact categories are most important to you and that you care about. And then you can compare the two products across many of those impact categories. And then you arrive at an answer, which is better for the environment based on what you care about. LCA was really how I got my start out of grad school to a certain degree. And then from there, had a lot of LCA jobs. So I worked at Mohawk Industries in Georgia, and I worked as a contractor at Pace Analytical, but our client was 3M. So I did a lot of life cycle assessment for 3M, a lot of their products. And then kind of a lot of other stuff happened. Then COVID hit. And then I kind of thanked COVID because it was my reset for my career. And it allowed me to inadvertently reposition myself on a food waste journey, which is what I always cared about the most and was a deep focus of mine in grad school. So yeah, I ended up getting fellowships or different positions at Project Drawdown, EPA, and now I very much use that in my full-time job at MnTAP.
I have a couple questions specifically surrounding Drawdown, because that's like a project that's near and dear that I utilize often. So you said you had a fellowship there. What specifically, sounds like you did food waste, but like, did you contribute to their book, or like what part of the process were you involved with that project?
Yeah, so the initial book that was published, I actually read before I worked at Drawdown, not realizing down the road I would actually end up contributing to the analysis. But being food systems were so near and dear to me. Food waste and plant-rich diets were two of the 100 solutions published that can contribute to drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And they actually both ranked, I think, in the top 5. They were quite high. That didn't surprise me because agriculture is such a beast. It's so resource intensive. It's so end-to-end, all-consuming. And so I was like, oh my goodness, like I love reading about all this stuff. During COVID, I saw on some job portal that a research fellowship was open with Drawdown. And I was like, oh, what's this? And I think they had several at the time because they were updating many of their solutions with new numbers and they wanted to see where everything ranked. And I saw in particular that food waste and plant-rich diets were 2 areas they were looking to update. And I was like, I'll throw my hat into the ring. And I technically actually was underqualified. I didn't quite have the amount of years of experience they were looking for.
Got to shoot that shot.
Exactly. I was like, they'll never know unless I submit my application. And then it turned into an interview and then a second round interview. And I answered as best I could based on all the questions they were asking me. And then that December, they were like, do you want to come work with us for 6 months and be one of our fellows on those 2 solutions? And I was like, absolutely.
That's awesome.
I think I recently learned that the program director lives here in Minnesota, which is like so cool.
Jonathan Foley.
Yeah. Just connected with him recently on something else. But yeah, just kind of fun because that's a project I've read a lot about and looked to for different things and utilize. So that's fun that they, regularly do the updates and you were a part of that.
Yeah, we should try to get him on the podcast too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because also, Taylor, wasn't that book kind of one of your first initial inspirations for this podcast?
A little bit, yeah. There's just so many topics. So when we were like, well, what are we going to talk about? I was like, there's 100 over here with detailed data and information that we can kind of dive into. So yeah, that's like kind of season 1. We did a lot of our episodes based on a lot of those chapters around that book. So
yeah, and Jonathan Foley and I actually never overlapped in terms of us having actual conversations because I was working at EPA concurrent to my research fellowship at Project Drawdown. So I always did work on the weekends and at night. So I never got to speak with any of my cohort class, and I never got to speak with anyone really except my co-fellow who was working on the 2 solutions with me.
So one thing that I'm curious about on this podcast, we like to give advice of how to get started in an environmental career, sustainability career. And it can be kind of a challenge because it's a very new field and there's not a lot of there's no blueprint to it. So you mentioned that life cycle assessment was one of your early starts. Can you talk about how to become proficient in that and how to use that to break into this field?
Yeah, and to actually take a step back, when I graduated from Carlson in 2013, I did not do anything for 3 years until grad school. I applied for jobs like crazy and I only got 4 interviews. And I graduated with really good academic credentials and experience. And sustainability was such a burgeoning field that you were up against 400 applicants for 1 job. And that was an entry-level job. And if it was a more senior job, good luck, you're not even close to getting this. So I knew I had to go back to grad school. And so I did. And then grad school allowed me to get the hard skills of life cycle assessment. And I had a professor tell me that very early on. She was like, okay, you came into our program. What skills do you want to glean from this? And I was like, oh, I love biomimicry. I want to like mimic nature and product design and like understand how do we reduce waste. She was like, that's not a hard skill. She was like, what are you leaving grad school with? And I was like, I don't know what you're asking me. And she was like, okay, life cycle assessment. It's a software. You can use it. We're going to teach it to you. And I was like, okay, great. Life cycle assessment's my answer.
That's a good professor
No
to
kidding.
really like push you on that.
She was like really like astute. And she actually ended up being my capstone advisor. But
Oh, cool. What was her name, if you don't mind?
Gabrielle Gaustad. She's out. I think now she's the dean of some school in New York. But she was very engineer type, like very, black and white. It was like, here's a hard skill. You are going to get that hard skill. It is a leg up you will have in the workplace. Once I got my master's degree, I got a lot more interviews, but it took me a few months to land my first contract, which had nothing to do with life cycle assessment. I was working on zero waste in California. And then from there, I interviewed a lot more. And eventually all of those interviews landed a job. And that job was for life cycle assessment in Georgia. So I would say if you're fortunate enough to study in a program where you're given those hard skills, lean on those. So for example, at MnTAP, we hire interns for our summer internships. Whenever candidates on their resumes have softwares as like a hard skill, I pay attention to that because I'm like, oh, you can code. That's going to help you in this position for XYZ reason. No different than life cycle assessment. If you have that as a skill and you can bring that to the table, employers are going to look at you differently than other people who don't, because that can help leverage, your expertise in the job that you're trying to get, and it will sell you better as a candidate.
I think that's great advice. I also think that's something that undergrads could take advice into when they're like kind of building out these programs, because I know when we did our sustainable systems management, there was not a ton of hard skills that you like dove deep into. And I think if I would have had that advice in college, because we dabbled in some stuff, I probably would have taken the effort outside of class to like go take a course on it and like get a little bit more in-depth knowledge so that when I did graduate, I'm like, hey, cool. Now I know, life cycle assessment or X, Y, and Z to be able to utilize that on a job application. That's great advice.
I agree. Speaking of life cycle assessment, I know you work with the wasted food scale a lot. Can you tell us what that is?
It's a revision of EPA's original food waste hierarchy from the 1990s. So I'm sure we've all seen the pyramid, the inverted pyramid. So at the top, you have source reduction. So don't generate waste in the first place, followed by reuse, which in the food space is kind of a misnomer. Reuse basically means like donation. And then from there, you have what would be called recycling, but it's not true recycling. It's composting, it's anaerobic digestion, and then other things we don't care about like incineration and landfill. Now, what's new about the wasted food scale is it's not a pyramid anymore, but it's kind of like a half ring. So it starts on the far left of like an image, and then it slowly swoops down like in a U shape. Then it goes across, and then it comes back up on the other side and stops. So it's like a half circle. And they call it the wasted food scale. And still all the same steps are relatively there. Some new ones are added. But certain strategies sit together. So there's no such thing really as like very sequential order top to bottom. It's very much like these two strategies are coupled together because life cycle assessments show that they performed relatively the same in our meta-analysis. Upcycling is a new addition to the wasted food scale and sits just below donation and right above animal feed. So it's something that actually I'm really excited about, and Sue Marshall's really excited about at NETZRO because there's so much potential. And Minneapolis is actually looking to become like a food epicenter of upcycling research and to start promoting entrepreneurial endeavors and initiatives, get cohorts going, get collectives going and accelerator programs, and bring a lot of infrastructure and like really exciting activity to the state as far as upcycling activity goes.
Can you talk about a little bit what food upcycling looks like?
Let's say that you have a pineapple. You have the rinds cut off from it. So you eat the fruit inside and then you have all this extra stuff that's not really edible. It's, supposed to be the protection of the fruit. Obviously, it did its job. You got to eat the fruit and enjoy it, but now you have all this leftover. What you could do with that is you could compost it, you could anaerobically digest it, you could send it to animal feed. Upcycling basically takes the notion of you run it through some piece of equipment, ideally, and that equipment will do different things to it. It'll draw out all the excess moisture, so water. It'll stabilize it at room temperature so it can sit longer and won't degrade. You won't have pests, you won't have smells, and it's very stable. And then from there, the nutrient profile can change based on when it went into the machine or when it came out of the machine. I'm kind of describing Sue's technology right now. There's a lot of different forms this can take.
It's a good reminder.
A little bit, yeah.
But essentially, whatever technology you feed it into, it's going to valorize it or add value to it in some way. And then once you have this output, you can do a lot of different testing on it. You can find a lot of different applications for it. So you can figure out, could we put this into treats that people will buy at Target? Could we put this into animal treats that people will buy at their local Chuck and Don's? Could we put this into textiles that people will wear on their bodies? Can we put this into bricks that people literally will build buildings with? There's so many cool applications for upcycled food. And there is also the Upcycled Food Association, which is a huge national consortium of organizations that are doing upcycling work. And based on what feedstock you want to handle, the upcycled technology in the company will be different because different feedstocks present different opportunities.
Definitely a good reminder from Sue's episode there for everybody. What is extended producer responsibility?
So this is something I actually don't work on a lot, but it's becoming more and more part of the popular parlance. So, there's a lot of people talking about it, national level, state level. Here in Minnesota, I believe we have 4 EPR laws currently, and they introduced into the legislation, the legislator back in 2021, I want to say, this really cool EPR legislation that focuses on packaging and paper products. So the triple P, PPP. And it's essentially this introduced legislation that tells the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that they'll have a hand in determining how much of each of these material streams we're producing. So we as consumers buy things all day long. Those come in different forms of packaging. What does that packaging look like across our state? What are the volumes being produced of soda cans, 6-pack rings, plastic bags? The list it's very, very extensive in terms of what it can cover. So there's a part of it that's doing a materials assessment and understanding how much is generated across the state. And then you have different producers of the packaging. So different companies will produce specific materials. They have a hand to play in it. It incentivizes producers of the materials to have a financial burden and to essentially reduce the harm that they're doing to the environment. How can you make the material that they're producing more reusable, more recyclable, more compostable? Why? Because they're in charge of it at the end of its life. They take it back. Or they pay for a system that allows for it to be taken back and make it into new things. So it's an encapsulating circular economy framework for a state focused on specific materials. And you have a lot of different stakeholders involved. You have the producers, you have government agencies, you have an advisory board, you have, I think, an agency like enforcer that can correct things if they're going wrong. And you can do this for myriad material streams. But it's a really cool way to put into policy and into legislation that producers must start doing this. And then consumers don't really feel the effects of it because when we purchase products, we pay for them twice. We pay for the product upfront when we purchase it off the shelf, but then we also pay for its disposal when we get rid of it. So essentially the system is trying to take that cost off of us as consumers and put it on the producer of the material.
That's interesting.
It's kind of, a unique way to build in circular economy policy.
Yeah.
But, I hadn't thought of it in that sense before.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about how we do pay for that product twice because, trash from recycling isn't free. You have to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I feel like I've been saying a lot recently is, especially when it comes to plastics, as we know, plastics get recycled at an abysmal rate, mostly due to the fact because there's an nth degree amount of types of plastic. And so one thing that I've been saying is kind of a crack pipe idea is I think that we need to make it so that like, all right, there's legislation that we're only allowed to make types 1 and 2 plastic for regular packaging or whatever. And then if you want to make another type of plastic for whatever reason you claim you need to have it, you have to be responsible for how that's disposed of or how that's handled, because that's then on you for your really fancy tech or for whatever reason you decide. And I feel like that would be like a good way to, one, stop having so many types of plastics, which would then make it easier to recycle. And then if there are, it's everything that you're talking about where it's, okay, cool, you want to do this? Okay, you have to handle it.
Yeah.
Yep. And because the system is so comprehensive and you have so many players on board, and the goal is to either have it be reusable, recyclable, or compostable, that really makes you think up front what you're putting in your product, right? So we're not trying to get like the Nobel Prize for the 186th type of plastic that was invented. What we're actually trying to do is go in the opposite direction and like simplify the system and make sure that everything works.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, is like, if we simplify the system, then everything on everybody gets a hell of a lot easier. And, on Logan's path, if there's only 2 things to recycle, we can actually have recycling facilities here that work well because they know exactly what they need to do. And it's really easy to separate those 2 types of recyclables. Yeah, or put it on people. So simplifying the system is just better for everybody in that case.
Especially for the average Joe, because I know like the biggest complaint with recycling and all these environmental feel-good things is it's so confusing and everyone doesn't really get what's going on and they feel discouraged. And yeah, I think that would make it a lot better. Back to how to handle waste. Reduce is number 1. And then if you can't reduce, you reuse. You work at the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program. You're also managing the Minnesota Materials Exchange. And my understanding is that MnTAP and MME really focus on those 2 items. Do you want to explain more?
So when I interviewed at MnTAP, I had never really worked on reuse because food waste was a big part of my background. But I'd always heard of reuse, and I, as a private citizen, never really took advantage of reuse. Like I always liked buying new. I never really liked reused things. I was just like, okay, there's a stigma to reuse and not one I like. I was like, I just want everything new. Now I'm the polar opposite after this because reuse is where it is on the hierarchy for a reason. A lot of energy, probably some water, and materials went into producing that product. So rather than getting rid of it after its first life cycle with its original owner, it actually is very good for the environment to donate it and allow someone else to get a second use out of it. And if that second person wants to donate it, a third, fourth, fifth, what have you. The Minnesota Materials Exchange is for businesses. So back in the 1980s, MnTAP was started in 1984. There was, probably within the first 5 years of the program, there was an initial focus on reuse. MnTAP actually started out of kind of hazardous waste and kind of waste issues. And so reuse was a part of that. Back then, nothing was digital, so everything was handled over the phone. And they'd put notices of items out in bulletins and like print newsletters that we still have in our office. And like different states would handle it differently, but you'd call people up and be like, hey, we have this item today. Would you be interested in it? And then you would coordinate an exchange over the phone. Since then, it's moved all digitally to our current platform of Minnesota Materials Exchange, and our provider is out of Canada. So part of my job is to work with organizations and get them engaged in reuse and promote a reuse ethic within their businesses. Don't throw all of that stuff away because you're downsizing and getting rid of an entire building. Donate it. Let me know that it's available. I have a listserv of several thousand people for MME that might be interested in it. A lot of times it's free, and people feel really good not only when they donate, but when they receive items. And then I, as the facilitator and administrator of MME, feel really good because I'm like, last year we kept 25,000 pounds of items out of the landfill.
That's huge.
Whoa.
We're really looking to amp up that work this year with some very strategic discussions around reuse. And Minnesota is very cutting edge when it comes to reuse. We have Reuse Minnesota, which is an umbrella organization for a lot of reuse businesses across the state. And I would say we're probably a top 5 state when it comes to a reuse ethic. So we're really fortunate.
You talked a little bit about the history of the Minnesota Technical Assistance Program. What is the day-to-day stuff that you guys do?
I'm the waste specialist, so I get to work on every material of concern under the sun. I can work on hazardous waste. I can work on non-haz waste. I can work on air emission waste, which is counted under our waste category. But then I also can kind of flex outside of that and work on water, energy, and chemicals as needed based on staff needing support or staff needing a second opinion, staff needing help with calculations. We are very lucky in that we get to decide who we want to outreach to on a daily basis for our work and who we want to work with. But also we have a lot of incoming requests because we've been around for 40 years, so we have very good relationships with organizations. And then we tackle inquiries based on what different businesses need help with. I'm kind of siloed in the waste realm because not a lot of colleagues work on waste as like its own thing. They might touch it in their other side recommendations to businesses if they're working on water or energy. But I'm also the same in that if I go into a business that's working on waste, I might identify water and energy opportunities. So all of us kind of work across all the different verticals to different degrees.
How long does the average project take, or does it vary depending on what the request is or system you're looking at?
It varies. Earlier this week, a recommendation letter went out to an organization that initially had approached us in fall of 2022. So that was a year and a half. There are others where within 2 weeks, the recommendation letter goes out and we kind of, deliver it. And then we say, if you want follow-up, let us know, but here's what we're recommending to you. So it's very staggered.
What would you say is like the coolest project you've worked on thus far in your career?
In my career? That's a good question.
Got to get the gold nuggets out at the end.
Probably, I think it was really special working at a federal level on food waste because I got to be part of so many different conversations with stakeholders. And there's not a specific project I would call out, but just the level of food waste at a national level and understanding what we were trying to tackle. And also being part of the grants when Congress passed all that funding via the different programs. Like I got to sit on those grant teams that actually ultimately ended up setting up the grant programs for many agencies and entities to apply to. So I got to be part of the internal discussions. Is that the coolest project? Certainly not. But the entirety of working at EPA was really, really cool.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I've been learning a lot about is that a lot of these environmental projects start with a grant. And it's the importance of programs like the ones you're working on. Is people who put that together is what are the people who really kind of spur the work that gets done.
Yeah, and working at EPA, like the people were like salt of the earth people because they are in their jobs because they're working on a mission. They care about doing better for the public and greater good. And incredible people to work with. They all cared so much. And it was awesome.
Well, thank you, Jon, for joining us today. This was really fascinating. It was fun to be able to kind of hit on a lot of these different topics that we have hit on throughout the many episodes we've done already and round that out. So thank you for sharing all of your expertise.
Yeah, and thank you for that solid advice to anybody still in college of the hard technical skills. That is one I will be continuing to say in every episode here on out.
Thank you for having me.
All right, until next time.